David Levin, Forever and Always, by Interfectorem. Unknown date. The darkness and ashes of the old world surround me. There is no light in this place. There is no drive anymore. God has been playing games with my life for as long as I can remember. History crept up behind and stabbed me in the back when I believed I was given a second chance. I cannot die now, so now I must live with all I've done and the spirits of everyone I've wronged. Chapter 1. David Levin. The farthest back I can truly and distinctly remember was when I was 7 years old on a summer day in 2057. I was at the DC Mall for the first time with my parents. The sky was clear on that day, and the air was so pure throughout the capital. From the foot of the Lincoln Memorial, we stood and looked up at the colossal man in his chair, although my fascination was with that tower beyond the reflecting pools called the Washington Monument. Dad put his hand on my shoulder and said, "All these monuments, all of them represent something truly fantastic. All these memorials symbolize someone who made tremendous sacrifices to make this country what it is today." I remember saying in a boyish and snide way, "I know, Dad. I learned all this in history class." He looked back at me as Mom took pictures of the memorial. "Someday you too will do great things." He gave a pause and added, "Each one of these men has lost a bit of themselves in the process, but it was all for the good of the nation." He stopped again to see that I was more focused on when we would go home. But I remember him finishing, "Just remember that, David." I looked at the Washington Monument in the mirror of the reflecting pool, still not able to appreciate what my father said as I looked at the simple structure. Thinking about it now, I still don't really know how to appreciate what Dad was trying to tell me, but at the time, I was just so innocent. I was just any other kid. I had no idea how the world worked and what was in store for it. Life was incredible, but nobody in the world knew how to appreciate it. I'm not sure why that memory in the DC Mall always stuck with me. Age 18, August 2067. We were in a plane on its way to the U.S. airfield 10 miles outside Montreal. The plane ride was fairly short due to Montreal's proximity to the East Coast. The platoon I was assigned in basic was paired with 4 others from the Boston and New York area in a cramped cargo plane for a total of 218 troops. I was actually very happy that they kept training platoons together. The military tried to stick to the idea of train together, fight together, die together. So I had at least some ease of mind. Knowing where I was going was made slightly less terrifying by the fact that I was with at least 50 guys I spent the last 8 weeks with. Crossing over the Canadian border, I looked out the side window. High above the earth, the ground started to look dead. Flying low from only 2,000 feet above the surface, the ground was turning into ash, and the full trees began to turn ever more twisted and black the closer we got to Montreal. We began to descend. As the plane veered in a different direction, I saw in the distance the outskirts of a torn city. I looked below us as the plane lowered further and saw several dozen army tents around the airbase. The plane rattled as we landed. Then the cargo door opened, and we were greeted with a thick layer of smoke in the air. When I stepped out onto the asphalt of the runway, I heard a succession of booms from artillery. I looked around. All the trees around us were charred or burning, and there was a tall layer of black smoke coming up from Montreal. The smoke layer was so thick that most of us were coughing away, and I remember wondering if we nuked the place, but no. I'm not an atmospheric scientist, but something we did incinerated the woods around the city and caused the air to turn toxic. Maybe it was the weeks of non-stop napalm bombardments, or maybe it was the Canadian chemical weapons that turned the foliage into blackened nightmarish entanglements emitting toxicity. All I knew was that I couldn't breathe, and I donned my gas mask as quickly as I could. Just then, the captain of our company formed us up with the other 4 companies that disembarked or were on standby at the airfield. The commanders spoke to the airbase leaders for a long time while the mass gaggle talked with their comrades about that big nightmare we knew we were going towards. After waiting around and adapting to life in a gas mask for a military amount of time, all the platoons boarded trucks to the Montreal line. We sat in the bed of each truck with 10 other men. Some of the guys took the moment to put their masks on if they hadn't already, as the trucks started to move. I breathed heavily through my mask and took in the scenery. I looked across the bed of the truck at the guys I oversaw. All of them wore their respirators and looked around the toxic war zone so alien to anything we had seen growing up, spoiled by peace. I just began counting the booms of artillery when Severin said to me, "How are you holding up, Levin?" I tightened the helmet around my head and replied, Good. A bit nervous, though." He let out a nervous laugh muffled by the respirator. "Same here, man. I got chills just stepping off that plane." I thought about the burning city that drew nearer. Then I thought about Savannah while I counted the booms of artillery again. I counted to myself 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. Then I said to him, "How many of them do you think are holed up in Montreal?" "People?" he asked. I said, "No, the enemy." He shouted over the wind and truck engine, "Well, from what I heard, everyone is an enemy. I heard from some guys on the plane who were pulled out of Quebec and Toronto. The folks there are putting up a tough resistance. They say that everyone not in a U.S. uniform is considered hostile." I recalled overhearing the same conversation on the plane and said, "I heard. I just wonder if Montreal will be the same." The truck rolled in the convoy down a wrecked, broken highway surrounded by the apocalyptic-looking landscape toward the Army siege line. The boom of American artillery grew louder and louder, and the smoke in the air grew thicker. Finally, we reached the main highway into Montreal, but we pulled off into one of many camps. When I stepped out of the truck, I looked toward Montreal. The wrecked city looked much closer then. The first skyscrapers of downtown were only a few miles away, but the scene around us had its own ominous image. Hundreds of soldiers patrolled the perimeter of the siege line, and many more sat in the trenches. Still, a layer of barbed wire and tank traps filled the outskirts of the line beneath a thick haze. The artillery was deafening at that spot in the line, and looking at the closest row of staggered howitzers made me shudder. Each recoiling barrel was followed by thunder and great bursts of smoke, and the ensuing flashes in the city marked death for anything in the blast area. The designated captain of our company jumped off his truck with his staff and yelled between the artillery blasts, "Form up!" We all got in our respective platoons. The other companies did the same. We marched along the dirt, mud, and ash roads following our company commander as everyone's eyes were transfixed on the scene from hell around us. The commander led us to a makeshift amphitheater in the middle of the base's command district. The acoustic shell behind the tiny stage was made of a crashed Canadian bomber, making the whole thing look like we were about to watch a sinister opera. We all took our seats in the fold-out chairs. We must have been really close to another artillery position then, because every time one of those guns went off, there would be a sharp ringing in my ears. Once the rest of the masked group sat down, I had removed my mask, just like many others among us, and Colonel Dawson came on the microphone. He stood up there in full kit, minus a helmet and gas mask, opening up with, "Good afternoon, gentlemen." We all yelled back, "Good afternoon, sir," and he continued, "All right, gentlemen, welcome to Montreal. Since most of you just got out of basic training and came straight to a goddamned war zone, I'll give you the sweep of what's going down. Welcome to the 98th Infantry Division." Our new colonel went on, but I felt my eyes drift away from the officer and towards two other soldiers leaning casually on heavy machine guns atop the stage behind. More artillery boomed nearby, and I watched them lower their masks to begin smoking cigarettes, laughing about something in full view of us new arrivals as if everything I learned about customs in Basic or Swiss, what little that was, simply didn't apply to us here. We have been holding the siege since May of this year, so let me cut to the part you all want to hear. There are a few ground rules we gotta run down before you kids join us on the Canadian front. The man paused as if he knew by instinct, and immediately, the row of howitzers hidden behind some nearby earthworks thundered, one after another, for almost a minute straight, every second offering the echo of the cracking explosion and the vibration of the air, until they fell completely silent. Only then were they replaced by other lines of guns further down the line going off. The ringing went on, and the colonel grew a clearly visible smile as he scanned the crowd. I felt my skin crawl as the smell of sulfurous gunpowder, poisonous chemicals, and muddy earth wafted over us. The commander resumed his speech as the ringing subsided, and my eyes went to the line of soldiers walking down the road past us in their gas masks. As I returned the mask to my face, I thought of the image of barbed wire lanes funneling soldiers to sectors, the mud trenches, the sea of men in green wearing their masks in the mud of the line. Then, one of the nearby howitzers fired again, and I thought of that poisonous smell as the image of that ruined concrete nightmare took shape in my mind as I heard the last words of the colonel's address. And so, in a week's time, we will begin the assault on Montreal. Congratulations, boys, you arrived just in time to kick some Canadian ass. Can I get a hooah? Instinctively, we all yelled the army battle cry back. But our cheer was an empty one. None of us wanted to go near that smoking carcass of a city under continuous shelling in the distance. That first day, all 5 platoons that were on that plane or at the airfield integrated into the 2nd Battalion, 160th Regiment of the 98th Infantry Division, according to Colonel Dawson. The battalion took up its residence in one of the underground bunkers on the 98th's end of the line. I learned that the 124th ID and 109th ID were also encamped around this region, and I almost couldn't believe the scale of this war. After almost 2 years of seeing the war from afar, watching our forces gallantly battle the Reds in Alaska, I was on the newest front of this war for our nation. Our loving neighbors had turned out not to be so loving, and the scene around a formerly prosperous first world city like Montreal was something horrifyingly unexpected. There were so many of us just surrounding this one city, and it was very clear that Uncle Sam was dead serious about wiping out Montreal. Since Toronto and Quebec City only recently fell after the US stormed across the northern border, this place was one of the last holdouts of officially Canadian cities. If what I'd seen since stepping off that plane was any indication of what was to come, I only wished I was more mentally ready. So me and 218 men in our new battalion, most of whom were fresh out of our basic training, lived in a big open bunker that was about 2 acres large. Sleeping on the cot and packed like sardines, I counted the steady rumble of artillery as I fell asleep that first night, thinking about why I was here, and about her. Chapter 2. I wasn't always this way. At the start of my story, I mentioned the memory of DC, my home city, and how my dad said I'd do great things. As great a man as my father was, he was utterly wrong about that. With my entry into the war described previously, I thought I was following in my father's example. It would be pretty early in that I learned how service and glory is ended in an instant when you live in a world that abandoned any claims on what's right after the front lines are established. It wasn't always that way, though. Before the wars came, and before learning how horrible of a person I am, I have to talk about why being stuck in an inescapable and terrible situation can be made worse by the rosy memories from a person or way of life that'll never again be attainable. Before my life in the wars, and before losing who I was, I grew up with a normal childhood, spoiled by peace, prosperity, and an idiotic sense of optimism. Even some of your more pessimistic moments aren't actually that when compared with what was to come. In any event, I suppose for my story to make sense, I have to go back again. Not quite as far back as my younger days, but as far as the moment I set myself on the course that led to a life tormented by hate, death, regret, and her face forever haunting my being. Age 15, 2064. Growing up, I was anything but extraordinary, and so the first act of my life was simply about existing. Years before, there I sat in the lunchroom with my only 3 friends as a freshman in high school. Roger, Kevin, Brandon, and I were the kids that nobody really talked to or even noticed. We were the, quote, other guys. We were the teenagers who were a form of background for the stereotypical high school scene. Nothing exciting ever really happened with us, and we were ostracized by the popular kids for whatever reason. Still, though, we were all somewhat good friends for what it was worth. I only mention all this in order to paint a picture of what exactly happened to me. The big problems for a middle-class teenager with all he could really want in the world were nothing compared to the life and hardships that eventually consumed my own world. So, I lived day to day, accompanied by my friends in the bizarre world of American high school and oblivious to the future. Roger was a big-boned kid and not much to look at. He was the victim in our friendship. We would always give him crap about things he did or how he behaved around other people. He was our collective punching bag and appeared to dress the part as well. He wore glasses, had a nearly shaved head, and wore plaid shirts. In other words, he dressed like a typical geek and wore a different colored pair of socks every day that usually stretched up to his knees, only asking for people to beat him up. However, he was relatively safe from others despite the target he seemed to dress as. I suppose at the time, people just felt bad for the guy. Despite his looks stereotypically, he completely sucked in school and made mostly D's or in the best cases C's. We hung out with him, or rather, he hung out with us simply because he was nearby. Almost like a stray pup following people from a distance, he just became a regular around us. Second, we had Kevin. I didn't know where to begin with Kevin. Long black hair that hung over his eyes, slim build, black t-shirts and dark blue jeans. That honestly just about summed him up. He had an ego that was larger than the universe despite his lack of skills in almost everything. He pissed me and nearly everyone off because he always played pranks and was totally obsessed with himself. He always talked about himself in the third person like an egotistical moron. That moronic and self-congratulating attitude tended to land him in a lot of trouble. In those cases, he retreated back to his band of other rejects and found comfort in numbers. Then there was Brandon. Brandon was probably the most normal of us all. The reason he hung out with us was that he was just socially awkward. He sometimes stuttered and had a bad habit of making a fool of himself only when everyone was watching. I liked to hang out with him the most because he was the most down-to-earth in our group. Finally, there was I. It is hard to explain oneself, but some words to describe me have been quiet, calm, smart, strange, buzzkill, normal-ish, and who? Nobody paid any real attention to us. Like I said, we were the background for the stereotypical high school scene. I think I painted a clear picture, but just imagine what your high school was like, and this was exactly it. Put another way, if they were to make a teen drama or some other bullshit about our school, my friends and I would have been nameless extras who get replaced by hired actors after taking too much notice of the cameras. Anyway, I worked out regularly with Brandon and kept good grades throughout school, but I had never been really popular or noticeable in any real way until what I'm about to describe. We sat at our own lunch table every day, just the four of us. We would get the occasional visitor who was outcasted from his group of friends for doing something wrong. The next day, they would be back with them, leaving us four alone to our rambling about stupid school stuff. One day in April, we sat in the lunchroom and talked. "Damn it, this food sucks," said Roger. We were startled by the outburst, and I said, "Is that news to you, Roger?" He said, "No, but it just sucks. Why can't they get us better stuff?" Nobody answered because we just learned to deal with things like that. That was the kind of thing that would happen almost daily. Brandon would then say something along the lines of, "You ready for the math test, Kevin?" To which Kevin would respond, "Me? Of course I am. I kick ass in math." He sucked at math, but that was also a natural thing with Kevin. Anyway, during that particular day in late April, I looked across the lunchroom over at one of the popular girls' table for a split second just to have a look at her. It disgusts me to even write this scene out, but when I saw her, nothing could ever stop my heart like she did. When I looked back at my friends, they had their eyes on me and stupid, smug grins. I asked what? They all stared with that look on their faces, except Brandon. Kevin said, "We saw you eyeing her again." I said, frustrated, "So what? I can't even look at girls without you dumbasses pouncing on me." Kevin replied, "Not girls, but girl in particular. Savannah Andres. We all know she gets your pants stirring. Prospect that could never be, huh?" I remained silent, waiting for the autistic part from Kevin. Besides, she is totally obsessed with me anyway. Kevin is far too awesome. There it was. I replied calmly with the twitch I get when one of them is making me frustrated. "Since when, Kevin?" She has never said more than, "Could you please get out of my way?" You always try that stupid move where you block her path in the hallway, only so she can shoo you away. Also, you wouldn't be sitting with us if you were that awesome. He said, She gives me signs." "Oh yeah. Like what?" I shouted in angry curiosity. He paused and his eyes darted from side to side. I can't think of any right now, but I will." It was like that all the time. I would ask him to prove something, and he never would. He said he would get back to me, but he always seemed to conveniently forget the entire incident. Yeah, whatever. I ended the pointless argument. Roger and Brandon were sitting there just watching us bicker back and forth about how Kevin wasn't the stud he said he was. I looked over at Savannah again, knowingly this time. She glanced over in my direction, but could have been looking at literally anything. Then she looked away. After looking away, I thought how awesome it would be if she were trying to see me. As soon as I realized how unlikely that was, the incident happened. Just then, I was in a headlock. Scott Hansen had me in a headlock and said, "What are you and your faggot friends doing, huh?" Kevin said, "Kevin ain't no..." But Kevin was immediately interrupted with a sharp, "Shut up, queer," from Scott. I bit into Scott's arm, he released his grip, and I stood up. I pushed him into the wall and he smacked my hand away. I yelled at him with some anger I didn't even think I had. "Fuck you, Scott. You want to fight like men? Or you want to keep getting me off guard like a fucking coward?" We stood staring at each other with intense anger in both our eyes. He scoffed and asked, "What? Want to meet in the parking lot to settle this once and for all? Ha ha ha." I said very angrily but strangely interested in his sarcastic proposal. "Okay, let's do it. Friday in the parking lot after school." He let out a laugh and said, "You've got to be kidding me." I said something that would have got me expelled if I was talking to literally anyone else. I said, You touch me before then and I'm gonna go home, get my dad's gun, and fucking... A look of shock appeared in my tormentor's eyes as I continued. I swear to you that I'll blow your fucking head off in the middle of this cafeteria. He stared into my eyes dumbfounded when he saw my psychotic gaze. Then he said calmly, "Fine then, you and me on Friday, see you then, pussy." He spit on me and walked out. The lunchroom was completely silent. A guy who hadn't been noticed by really anyone in all my years of school and nearly the entire first year of high school had just drew the attention of everyone. I was more expecting to fight right there, and was surprised he agreed to wait till Friday. Then I remembered that I threatened to murder him and sat down at the table. Sitting down, I thought to myself, I didn't know why Scott hated me. One day out of the blue, he just started being a jerk towards Kevin, which was pretty understandable. When Kevin retreated to the safety of me, Brandon, and even Roger, he backed off but made an odd sort of eye contact with me. Over the past few days, I had been harassed by him enough to be in the current situation. Still staring at the food on my plate, I snapped myself out of the trance and noticed my friends and the rest of the lunchroom were still staring at me. Fully aware of my surroundings, I refused to look up. Lunch eventually ended, and I went through the rest of the day getting strange looks in the hallway until the bell rang. I took the bus ride home in complete silence. On the bus, everybody was dumbly asking me about why I challenged Scott to such a bizarrely typical fight. I just thanked God that nobody was close enough to hear me threaten him. Immediately, when I got off at my bus stop, I walked through the quiet streets of Georgetown. By 3 o'clock, I got home. I barged through the door and my mom asked, "How was school?" like she always did, but I ignored her and slammed the door to my room. I didn't bother with my homework. I was too upset with what happened at school. I lay there on my bed, looking up at the ceiling, just thinking. At 5 o'clock, I went into the bathroom, plugged in the electric razor, and gave myself a personal haircut. I don't know what on earth possessed me to do that. When I finally went downstairs for dinner, my dad asked, "Where did you get the haircut?" My hair was very short on the sides, short on the top, and spiked up front. I said, "Don't worry about it, I like it this way." I did, and briefly admired my own miraculously acquired barber skills in my silverware. He and Mom looked at me, puzzled for a while. We finished eating, and they didn't see me in the morning that Thursday. On Thursday, I avoided my friends and thought about my fight the next day. Thursday was normally my day to go to the gym with Brandon, but I completely skipped out on that. Instead, I went up to my room and repeated yesterday's routine minus the haircut. On Friday, I arrived at school. The entire day people gave me the, "You're screwed" look. Apparently, Scott told just about everyone what he was going to do to me, and so I was fairly ready to die. Finally, at the end of the day, I stepped out of those doors, and standing in the thinning parking lot was a big crowd of teens. There in the middle, Scott stood. The people formed a large circle and watched me approach my supposed death sentence. It was like out of one of those awful teen dramas, or a stereotype of a grade school fight. Like I said, almost anyone who'd ever been to an American high school or watched a show about one can easily visualize this scene I was in. I reached the center of the crowd, where I saw the bully I threatened to murder. Scott wore black shorts, a black sleeveless shirt, and a grin that said once again, "You're screwed." As I approached, I looked around the circle at all the spectators. The key people I care to mention were Kevin, who was brushing the hair out of his eyes, trying to capture the whole scene. Roger stood there, stupidly biting his nails out of either OCD-like habit or nervous anticipation. Then there were Savannah's friends, the blonde one and the black-haired one. It's been a long time, and I don't really remember or care enough to remember their names. The teen crowd was placing bets on who would win, and the few people who placed money on me were laughed at. Scott approached and stood less than a foot from me. He got up closer and said, "Are you ready to die?" Nobody threatens me and walks away. I looked at the ground momentarily and then kneed him in the nuts. The crowd gasped as he dropped to his knees. From there, I punched him in the face really hard and he fell back onto his arm. Initially, I believed I won right there, but he got up and swung his heavy fist at my face. I miraculously ducked, and he missed. He swung again and hit me in the gut, knocking the wind out of me. I looked up from my pain, his fist flew at my face, and I was hit in the left eye. I didn't fall back, but I was disoriented as my left vision went slightly blurry. I fell onto one knee and looked at my own fists that hurt. I received an adrenaline rush and charged Scott. He hit me in the arm sharply, but I tackled him to the ground. The crowd gasped again, and the weight of my body pinned him to the ground while I pounded his face. He yelled in horror and pain the whole time while I delivered punch after punch to his stupid fucking face. Blood started to rise out his mouth, but I kept hitting him over and over again. I pulled on the collar of his shirt, head-butted him, and he was unconscious. I got up, still wired, upset, angry, sad, lost, and filled with rage. I gave a hard kick to the ribs of the unconscious body, didn't feel like that was enough, and gave him 2 more. After spitting on his chest in the same place he did to me, my blurry red vision lightened around the edges, and I saw the others. I looked around at each face in the crowd as my mind leveled itself out, still dazed and disoriented. All the people were wide-eyed. I looked over at Kevin and Roger. Their mouths were wide open, and their eyes were big as saucers. The same look was on the face of Savannah's friends. I walked toward the 2 girls, neglecting my friends, and they parted, making a way out of the circle. I walked through them, and everyone was silent without a word to be said. Author's note. Fair word of warning. The chapters set during the school days will be a tad on the cliché side. I do that for a reason that may become apparent. Just felt that would be fair to point that out. No need to review about that, I'm aware. Chapter 3. What's to come? I can't say for certain how I acquired that rage in me. Like I said, I was just a nobody in school who had been labeled an outcast for whatever reason. Nothing was particularly wrong with me, but as an outcast in high school who wasn't noticed by anyone, I certainly made a name for myself in that fight seen by the whole school. Leaving everyone speechless after what I did to Scott and what that incident later led to, I still think about that with pride and thankfulness. I sometimes recall those first days in the war and that first fight. Comparing what you thought was bad with something you know is bad is something I do often. With that first fight I know led to something good. I remember thinking about how that first fight in Canada might lead to something good as well. However, the circumstances around that first time near Montreal had a completely different tone that I knew in my heart would lead to more bad. Age 18. August 2067. We fresh troops adjusted the best we could to the life of a U.S. soldier besieging a first world city, and carried our rifles with us all the time, always wearing our combat gear during the day and even to sleep. The Canadian artillery grew more and more fierce over the days. The thump of our own guns was continuous, and the Canadian shells hit the siege line constantly. Every day my squad would patrol the burnt forest to the west, going toward the river. On my 4th day in the Montreal region, something bad happened. I led my squad through the woods along the normal patrol route. I wore my gas mask there, especially because the thick forest still burned and released a ferocious gas and smoke fume. I looked back at my men, who all looked the same, without a real identifiable distinction, and carried their guns lowered. Suddenly, a branch fell in the distance, and I raised my R91. Then I held up my fist for my guys to halt. The faint boom of the artillery grew in the distance, and the smoke layer in the forest became thicker. I asked our medic, Quinn Andrews, identified only by the red cross patch on his arm plates. "Did you see anything?" He asked in a hushed tone. "Like what?" I told him. "That branch fell in the distance. Was just wondering if you saw anything." He looked around the forest, and our guys got into a crouched position. He whispered, "I think you're just being paranoid. We're too close to the line anyway." Just then, a jet flew overhead. It sounded so loud I couldn't hear anything else, and the rumble sent a vibrating wave through my bones. When it passed, I looked back at my squad. Peddler was on the ground, dead with a bullet hole through the right lens of his mask. I immediately yelled to my guys, "Get down!" And another shot is fired. Miller screamed. We were all covered by a burnt log, so the sniper couldn't see us. I crawled along the forest floor over to Miller, while my other friends dragged the body of Peddler to our cover and began uselessly checking for a pulse. Looking at Miller, the young man sobbed and choked on his tears that seemed to fill and fog the inside of his respirator. A bullet hit him between his shoulder guard and chest plate. I panicked. I wasn't properly trained on anything my IFAC had for the situation, and I still had that sniper out there, so I said, "Andrews, see to him." Based on the blood, there was nothing we dumb assaultmen could do, and we were too green for any medical approach with that sniper out there. I was still processing the fact that Peddler was no longer with the living, while Andrews was working on Miller, who was still bleeding heavily. My mind caught up to the present, and I turned my scrambling thoughts to what me and the rest of my boys and I had been trained for. I looked over at my guys taking cover behind the trees and log, shouting with a voice I tried to keep calm, "Okay guys, this sniper is pretty good, we got it." But then I am interrupted by Styles. "Let's kill this fucker. Look what he did to Peddler." Mind-stirring, I had never been shot at, and who the hell decided to put me in charge? I scrambled to collect myself and shouted, "Hold up! Fucker has us pinned. Any move from any of us and we're dead. I'll see what I can do about it." I grabbed the radio off of Miller while being fixed up by Andrews. He had gone unconscious at that point, and everyone was calm. Covered and minds panicked, but calm and low. I turned the radio to our company's channel and said into it, "Hello?" Forgetting the proper speech for military radio etiquette. Suddenly, I heard our company commander, Captain Morales, was on the other end. I said, "Captain, this is Charlie Company, 2nd Platoon, 2nd Squad Leader Corporal David Levin speaking." He heard the worry and panic in my voice and shouted, "What is it, soldier?" I said, "Mission assignment India sector sweep through. Encountered enemy sniper. Request air support." He was less than happy on the other end and said, "Negative, Corporal. India is too close to Western Delta. Grow a pair of balls and take out that sniper by yourself." The radio went silent. I was fairly shocked that our commander told us to go fuck ourselves. So, I conjured up a plan as fast as I could. I remembered that we were facing a largely ill-equipped militia force this close to our lines. The Canadian Regular Army was dug in around the city. That meant that this guy was probably not ready for an assault, despite how fatal his first shot was. I said to Savarin, "Give me a smoke grenade." He tossed me one, I pulled the pins, and chucked it in the direction of the sniper. Another shot rang out, but it hit nothing. The smoke cloud grew steadily but moved in the wind, and I ordered another one to be thrown to mix with the rising fumes of the scorched forest. Training spoke for me, and I told my squad, "Switch to thermal." I flipped the switch on the side of my gas mask, and my vision turned dark purple. I stood up and briefly saw the outline of a man, but he disappeared behind the trees. Savarin, our light machine gunner, released a spray of bullets from his position. After a few seconds of semi-accurate fire from the whole squad, Savarin said, "Got him." We all left our cover and cautiously approached the man who took out Peddler and wounded Miller, leaving Andrews to his work. Walking forward, the breathing in my mask started to get more difficult, even after brushing the forest debris from the opening. I needed a new filter soon, since I could almost taste the toxic debris and fumes of the forest. We stumbled upon the dead body there in the middle of the woods. He lay there on his chest with a busted old hunting rifle in his right hand. Bullet holes from Savarin's LMG filled his back. I turned the man's body over. He was dead all right. He wore a breathing mask that covered his nose and mouth, and his eyes almost glowed red through the welding goggles around them. As I studied the body, I wondered how long the man had been waiting in the toxic forest just to kill a stray American patrol, while the dark red blood pooled onto the ground around him. My guys then began to loot his body for intel or whatever. No folder of vital mission documents or maps of Canadian artillery positions. He had a wallet with a driver's license and 60 Canadian dollars. His name was Greg Feckmuller. We left the body there on the forest floor and headed back for our bunker, carting Miller to the nearest triage station and the body of Peddler. That day was August 2nd. The 5th would be when the Army launched the assault on Montreal. After that skirmish, and after our squad was relieved of duty, the shock of the day and the loss of nearly 2 of my boys stuck with me. Killed and wounded by a lone guy with a rifle and chemical equipment you could buy at any hardware store back home. I sat on my bedroll in the bunker, still shaken from everything that happened. The artillery continued to thump, and I wrote my first letter to Savannah by the lantern light. This was my first letter since leaving the basic training Swiss program and arriving in Montreal. Dear Savannah, I finished basic and combat training on July 22nd, but have still been unable to write to you. I am nearing the end of my first week here in the war zone of Montreal. I'm sure you have seen the place on TV. I'll try to say hello on one of the news cameras. Today, on August 2nd, 2067, I experienced my first taste of combat. I was scared. The sniper managed to injure my squad mates, Lance Peddler and Barry Miller. Don't be scared for me, though. Nothing can stop me from getting home to you, so remember that. Captain Morales says we will try to take the city on the 5th. Hopefully this gets to you by then. Be praying for me in the next few days, and I will try to write to you the next time I can. Love you. Love, David Levin. I kept the true details of all that happened on the second out, but Miller got out of the medic unit the next day. Peddler's body was put in a box, and the next few days went by slowly. The bombardment by the Air Force was steadily getting even more intense over the following evenings, as the few days spent on the line never stopped shaking my nerves, and for good reason too. I was on watch one day and saw Colonel Dawson giving his welcome speech to another new company when a Canadian shell hit near the platform he was standing on. The explosion killed 4 men in the audience, and the distant shockwave scattered more than a dozen others from their seats. Dawson was protected by the thick walls of the surrounding bomber structure, but his speech remained on hold as the crowd collected itself and a medic team from the trenches was gathered. The medics carted the bodies and the injured to casualty clearing stations or aid posts, and more long lines of soldiers in their gas masks walked to their sectors or bunkers on the line. The soldiers saw the carnage and scarcely paid any mind to the cleanup happening in the makeshift amphitheater. The nearby row of howitzers began their mad minute of ceaseless fire, and my ears rang as I watched with some new slight amusement as I watched the scene. I watched the new men shuddering at the thundering guns, only to begin gagging and donning their masks again as the guns ceased and the poisonous fumes wafted over to those in the seats, only adding to the poisonous air. As the bodies and injured continued to be dragged away, I knew I was still so new to this horror, but something inside me whispered, "Welcome to Canada." Chapter 4. The Results. Age 15, 2064. On my way home, I wiped the blood off my mouth and thought to myself as my body and mind leveled out from the fight. Those who bet on Scott winning sure were surprised when I kicked the fuck out of him. Mostly, I thought about Savannah and Brandon, the 2 people I cared to notice who weren't at the fight. Why hadn't they shown up? Just about everyone I'd ever seen in school was there. They didn't believe in me? I can excuse my crush not being there, but Brandon should have been there at least. Hell, Kevin and Roger showed up to the fight and I briefly overheard those retards bet against me. Fuck them. The thoughts about the 2 who weren't there occupied my mind for a while. Eventually, I didn't care where my friends were, present and betting against me, or somewhere else, and, who knows why, didn't matter. I finally found myself thinking almost solely about my crush. Why wasn't Savannah Andres there? Literally everyone else was. Those thoughts dwelled on me and went in circle after circle the entire walk home. But then, as I went up the steps and put the key in the door, I realized something. Savannah must actually care about me. I'd long since disregarded Brandon, but Savannah didn't want to see me get hurt. Maybe. I had literally nothing to base that conclusion on, but maybe was good enough for me. I ran in the door, happier than ever. Not caring about my coward friends, I was happy just naively believing that I had a crush who didn't want to see me get hurt. When Mom asked how school was, I said it was wonderful as I sprinted up the stairs. That night at the dinner table, there was a different mood. Dad eventually looked up from his plate to finally notice his son and said, "What happened to your goddamned face?" My old man studied my still bleeding face and bruised eye. I replied, "You know Scott, right?" He instantly snapped, "By God, if he beats you up, I'm going to go to his house and kill him myself." I cut him off. "No, Dad, it's not like that. I was the one who beat him up." Mom, who'd been unusually quiet and unobservant of my condition, put down her silverware in shock. After a short silence, Dad exclaimed, "Nice, son. How long did you get suspended for?" I told him giddily, I didn't get suspended at all. It was after hours, and none of the staff saw what happened. That ended up being true. I faced no official repercussions for what happened with Scott, but school was about to change. Slightly, but different nonetheless. That night I slept very satisfied, but the next Monday I was quite surprised. Over the weekend, I got some calls from people I've only seen before saying, "Good job." I knew Scott was a scumbag to everyone, but never thought people would look up my home phone number to thank me for knocking him down a peg. So, on that Monday, people looked at me in a new light, again thanking me in the halls, but at lunchtime, I still sat with my friends. Kevin and Roger sat quietly, looking at me with confused expressions. I broke the awkward silence by nearly shouting, "What?" Then Kevin said inquisitively, "How on earth did you beat the shit out of Scott?" I looked at Roger, and he was nodding his head, waiting for an answer. Brandon also looked at me with interest, and then I said, "I just want to know, why you 2 bet against me?" Kevin rolled his eyes and said, "Oh, simmer down. Everyone was thinking Scott would win. We weren't the only ones. Besides, I thought I could get an easy $30. If you look at Lewis over there, he threw down a shitload of cash on you and got over 200. You can see it in his shoes." Lewis walked by us wearing some posh-looking new shoes. He gave me a thumbs up and said, "You're the man, Dave." I wondered why Lewis said that before my first hour class. I looked back at Kevin and warned, "Next time you 2 don't have my back, you will be where Scott was." Kevin rolled his eyes again, but Roger seemed to take the warning. Brandon was just silent, like he mostly was. Then Roger recovered from his skittishness and threw in, "Anyway, I heard that Scott has 4 stitches in his face, 2 broken ribs, and a broken nose. You really did a number on him. Not to mention that he's probably got to go through puberty all over again after that knee to the balls." I learned not to care when he or Kevin were rambling on, so I looked over at Savannah from across the lunchroom with my natural unconscious look of longing and dread. The 2 friends who were at the fight looked over at me. The blonde one turned around to point me out, but when she saw me looking their way, she immediately turned back. My friends were staring at me still, and I was tired of people watching me like a zoo animal when Kevin said, "Oh, that's right, Savannah, she has to go out with you now." You know, if she weren't so interested in Kevin himself. I disregarded his unfounded self-compliment and gave him a simple no. I wasn't going to make a move. I hated even talking about girls around my friends. At this point in my life, I had the naive belief that things sucked without a frame of reference. Still, I couldn't be the guy who goes around boasting about being in fights. I just wasn't that person, neither physically nor mentally. Although it was funny that he mentioned how Savannah would go for me, because that day I initiated something. I didn't know what it was, but it was something. Later on, I was walking through the halls on my way to the next class. I was looking at the ground as I usually do, and suddenly bumped into her, literally. I looked up to see who I collided with, and there she was. I had only been that close to her maybe one other time. I still remember what she wore that day in late freshman year. She wore a black skirt, Converse, and a white t-shirt. She had a pretty yellow ribbon in her long brown hair, and 2 round earrings. I told her as one does when they accidentally invade one's personal space. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she replied with a smile and said, "Don't worry about it, David. Say, I heard about your fight." I swallowed hard, thinking more about how a move that Kevin would have tried was accidentally working with me. I heard her statement in my mind again, and felt the appropriate thing to do would be to respond. "You did you? I saw your friends there." "What? Nothing. What am I doing?" She smiled again. "Well, thank goodness he got what he deserved. He's a real jerk." She paused for a moment, looking at me, and said, "Well, I'll see you around, David." Just like that, she walked away. I looked back at her and thought of her face and smile. Her voice repeated in my head over and over again, but I could only think of what she said at the start. "Don't worry about it, David." Oh my God, she knows my name, was the only thing I could think. That shouldn't have been a surprise, considering most people in school at least heard of my name by this point, but that didn't matter. Kevin and Roger were over by their lockers, watching the whole thing. Kevin, of course, was smiling widely, while Roger looked past me in a weird daze. The school year ended in mid-May. That moment with Savannah was the only real one for the rest of the school year. She would say hi every now and then, but that was about it. Scott got out of the hospital the week after the fight. He never even looked my way after that, and I never had any interest in gloating or even acknowledging his existence. We completely avoided each other, and that was fine by me. I went to the gym with Brandon over that summer, and we worked out all the time. I also hung out with him at his house quite often. I know I haven't talked about him much, but he and I really were pretty close when it was just us. I believe he was mostly silent at school due to the issue of embarrassing himself, and to avoid engaging in stupid arguments with Kevin. So, we were the kind of close that I even had dinner with his family on occasion. I liked his dad, Bill McNamara, who was an extremely high-ranking member of the government's National Security Agency. The man even went by National Security Advisor McNamara with strangers, but I got to call him Bill. Anyway, he always had interesting stories about politics or the Pentagon, and got to work closely with the president. Dinners at his place were fun, and Brandon's mom was a great cook and wonderful person. She even made enough for the 2 security agents that guarded their house 24/7. Brandon also had a little sister who was only 11 years old at the time. Her name was Ashley, and we used to mess with her a lot just because she was little. All that usually stopped when she'd cry, and Brandon's mom would scold us. It was all in stupid and boyish teenage fun, but she was really sweet nonetheless. So, I hung out with Brandon mostly because he still lived in Georgetown. We got along best, and he was only like 2 blocks away from my house. Part of me did wonder why Brandon didn't go to a private school or a prestigious boarding school in another state like most of the other children of high government officials who live in Georgetown of the D.C. area. Brandon really did have good grades in school and certainly could have gone if his father wanted it. Thinking about it now, and knowing Bill McNamara better, I think the decision to keep Brandon in public school came largely from the traditionalist grounding of men like Bill and my own father. Those men grew up in an environment where they'd end up with the basic worldview that everyone has to work for what they get, and I won't let my own children get spoiled. There could have been more to it, but that was the impression I got from knowing Bill McNamara on a somewhat personal level, despite his extremely high government position. Either way, Kevin and Roger were sort of on the opposite end of the spectrum in their family situations. I did spend a little time with Kevin and Roger over that summer. Roger lived in a trailer with his mom that was illegally parked behind a grocery store, so I tried to avoid hanging out at his place. Kevin never told me where he lived despite our friendship. He'd come over to my house sometimes and leave after saying, "Gotta go before it gets too dark out." Some people thought he was homeless, but he didn't smell, look homeless, or have any real homeless habits, so we never really knew. I always talk about the two together because Roger was Kevin's pet in a way, or acted as his shadow. They'd go around town to do stupid pranks on DC tourists and get in trouble with security guards. Those two were hardly ever seen apart, but Roger was easily manipulated, so I understood why Kevin kept him around. In August, school started again, and I was a sophomore. That first day, I was introduced to my instructors. Throughout the day, I looked for Savannah and thought about her all summer. Eventually, I found my dumbass friends and sat with them at lunch. After lunch, I went over to my locker to get stuff for my next class. I was digging in my newly assigned locker, getting out some materials for the next class. I looked behind to see some new freshmen looking for their lockers, and thought idiot freshmen as day one sophomores tend to do. After mocking them to myself, I glanced down the hall, and there she was, walking toward me. I naturally shoved my face into my locker, trying to hide. In the darkness of my locker, I thought, should I come out and talk? Should I stay hidden? Or should I look to see if she passed? I very slowly peeked out, and she was right next to me, I thought. Oh no. At the same time thinking, oh yes. I subtly looked back into my locker, but then she tapped me on the shoulder and asked sweetly, "Excuse me, do you know how to work these locks?" I didn't have one last year. My face was still hidden by the locker door, but I said, "You have to rotate it around right 3 times. Stop on the number. Then rotate it counterclockwise twice. Stop on the number. Then go to the right and land on the last number." She did that, and I heard the metallic lock open. She said a simple, "Thanks." Unable to control the volume of my voice, I shouted, "You're welcome," into the locker. She put some stuff in the locker and started to walk away. I looked at her as she walked. Then she turned her head and smiled at me. I pretended not to notice and pretended to fix the hinge, then walked down the hall to my next class. I sat there in my chemistry class, half dead. 10 minutes into the class, she came in. The teacher asked why she was late, and she said she got a schedule change. Because of that schedule change, she had the last 3 classes of the day with me. She sat with her friend, the black-haired one. I remember her name now. It was Krista. Things went on stagnantly for a while, but a few days later the elective classes and activity board came out. This is unrelated to Savannah and my friends, but that thing was a big board in the hallway that had a list of all the classes or activities you could take. I looked at the board with everyone else. The one activity that really caught my eye was the military training program. I grabbed up the brochure, remembering that my dad took the class when he was in high school. It said that the class was available to sophomores, juniors, and seniors, so this was perfect. Reading more into the brochure, I found the brief intro to the class. In the military training program, our mission is to take ordinary American students and train them physically and mentally for their future service in the armed forces. It is the program's goal to keep the American student fighting fit for any invasion of the American homeland. It continued, the class will be taught by former Sergeant First Class James Morris. This program is not part of JROTC and teaches high schoolers about America's global situation, instilling America's youth with an unshakable sense of duty and patriotism. I read more into what the class involved. The program includes intense exercise, hand-to-hand combat drill and ceremony, military history, and occasional exercises at the local firing range. No more. This sounded like the program for me. I'll talk about the MTP more, but feeling good from a great summer and supposed progress with my crush, I looked at that brochure with purpose. I was always taught that the world was a dangerous place, and the fight with Scott last year threw me into what I thought was the deep end. I eagerly signed up for the activity, and though I do not regret that, I regret my optimism in thinking something as simple as a class could prepare me for anything life would hurl my way. Like the assault on Montreal. Chapter 5. The Assault on Montreal. On the evening of the 4th, Captain Morales stepped down into the bunker and yelled, "Listen up! There's more I could say about the whole thing, but I'll give the simplest rundown I can." Everyone in the bunker gathered around him, and he continued. "The assault on Montreal begins tomorrow morning." There was silence in the packed bomb shelter. "The 98th and the 109th Infantry Divisions are beginning the assault. Luckily, our regiment and some bastards from the 109th will be the spearhead in the opening strike. Our mission is to take up defensive positions in the city under the cover of an intense bombing run. We are to hold positions so that the second wave of infantry can have a clear route of advance, doing our typical leapfrog. So, follow your butter bars if you can, and establish comms wherever you find yourselves. Get some sleep, men. I won't lie to y'all, many will die in this assault. So, keep your heads on straight, remember your training, and you'll get out of this. Or not. See you on the other end." He then handed folders to his LTs, and we all gathered around our officers for more in-depth objective details. No days or weeks of planning for the individual units, just run towards that meat grinder and try to jam it up for the next wave. The morning of the 5th finally came. At 0400, the alarm in the bunker sounded, as if the alarm was necessary since me and everyone else in the company couldn't sleep and were watching the big clock on the southern wall every second. With the alarm blaring, everyone sprang up and grabbed their field packs and weapons. I fixed my gas mask on and tightened my helmet, waiting with the massed congregation by the blast doors. I took the moment to account for my guys, and we all waited by the blast doors to slowly creak open. The alarm faded only for another alarm to rapidly beep, and the blast doors slowly lifted open, exposing the broad and dark 15 steps to the siege line. When the doors opened, the whole company charged out, and my squad stuck with me. Going up those steps, I found myself transfixed on the sky. The picture above the dark world was reddened by fire with dark clouds from nature, light jet trails, and black smoke from the artillery. And my first thoughts were how this sky looked like a Renaissance art depiction of what happens in Revelations. Back in the world, the boom of artillery continued non-stop as it had for days. Jets roared overhead, explosions echoed, men yelled screams of bravery or fear, high caliber. Machine guns clattered at distant nothingness. Paratroopers poured out over the city, and hundreds of soldiers from the different siege bunkers streamed out of the ground towards several truck lines pointed at Montreal. Our company reached its section of designated trucks, and I filed into a vacant one with my squad. As soon as we were all in place, demo charges went off along the avenue of advance, clearing the way forward of barbed wire and tank traps. As the scene unfolded, and the other first strike regiments got in their trucks, our group started moving, going full speed toward the city. We drove fast in a formation of some 30 other trucks packed to the brim with infantrymen. The way between Montreal and the Army's line used to be suburbs, but had long since been leveled in the bombardments, making the ride to Montreal a rough and bumpy mess over the ruins of former homes. As the truck rocked chaotically, I looked at the city that drew closer and closer, curious about the absence of Canadian shells. Just then, a dozen flashes appeared over the city, and mortars exploded left and right. The trucks were getting hammered non-stop by high explosives. Another wave of jets flew overhead and bombed the city, but the artillery still fell. I kept my helmet in place by holding it down despite the strap as the truck tossed left and right. We drove at what felt like full speed with the other trucks through the suburbs, over wreckage, and around shell holes, with one of the other trucks occasionally suffering from the rain of mortar shells. The closer we got, the higher the buildings began to rise, and eventually we reached a point where the Canadian artillery ceased. Riding further into Montreal, the formation of trucks dispersed after the leveled suburban no-man's land turned into what could be a city. Going down a torn street, our truck group was only 3, and all was relatively quiet, even as our group crossed the river on the Pont Champlain Bridge that was surprisingly unprotected by Canadian regulars. As soon as we reached the other side, we were in the real streets of Montreal proper with tall buildings on both sides. Not even a block from the bridge, our truck was hit by a bomb. It toppled over and threw me out onto the asphalt, disoriented, but largely unscathed. While on the ground, I looked up and gathered myself, mask cracked and covered in ash. 2 men from our ride were dead, but the 5 men in my squad were okay, as they seemed to stagger themselves up as well. Just then, one of the trucks following us pulled in at the toppled side of our ride, and the soldiers jumped out. As the troops filed out of their truck, I looked up at the rooftops to my left and right when machine guns suddenly opened fire on us from ground level. 3 soldiers from the other vehicle instantly fell dead to the ground. Down the street, Canadian militants fired on us from behind rubble as most of us were still disoriented from the bomb. We blindly fired back while struggling to regroup, and some of our guys threw smoke grenades. As the cloud grew and thunder from ahead continued, one of our soldiers shouted an order of charge. The world still cracked and foggy. My instinctive soldier brain kicked in to follow the order regardless of who shouted it. We all left our cover and ran through the smoke. Once on the other side, I saw the Canadian muzzle flashes, raised my R91, aimed it at one of the militants, and put 2 bullets in the nameless man's chest. I killed a person. I didn't even know how to take killing a person in that moment, but I remember a strange thought going through my head immediately after I did what I did. The effect of a rifle round on a person was astonishing. The effect on a person of a .556 bullet at 2,790 feet per second pierced right through the man's chest and left its mark in blood all over the wall behind him. I was in shock, and the world seemed to slow. Stiles tapped me on the shoulder in the middle of the firefight and shouted through the mask-muffling chaos around us. "Are you okay, man?" I shook it off, and we continued to discharge round after round in pure survival. Suddenly, another one of our trucks pulled in and unloaded its guys to join us. In the chaos and confusion of the fight, I killed another person. This was simply by pointing my rifle at a human-shaped outline partially blocked by a concrete pillar, then pulling the trigger. 1 round. That was all it took to bring down the other guy. Soon afterward, the fight was over. There were 3 Canadian regulars in battered equipment who were wounded. Some of the soldiers shot them on the ground as they tried to crawl away or gave up in exhaustion. We gathered up for a collective breath, and I checked who was next to me. I couldn't believe it. My entire squad was still alive. As we collected ourselves after the shootout, I took the moment to take a good head count of who we had in this hostile city street. There were 31 or 32 of us in the group, including me and my guys. After everyone seemed rested up, a commanding American voice from up ahead shouted, "Let's get moving down this street. Y'all know your orders. Take a strategic point. This fucking alley ain't one of them. No questions." The mishmash of friendlies from the random truck groups had to get going. We moved down the street in lines, hugging each building along both sides, hearing the distant fights on other avenues and explosions from American shells landing further in the city. Knowing our group was alone in this part of town, we were all on edge, scanning the rooftops for activity, and wondering when the next ambush or platoon of Canadians would show. A few minutes later, one guy in the front of the line held up his hand, ordering us to stop. He whispered down the line and word was passed to each person. "Canadian regulars up ahead." As soon as I got the word, a large burst from a howitzer cracked from just up ahead. Once the word reached the last person, the soldier at the head gave a signal to rally. We all gathered as a group in the center of the street, behind some wrecked cars, where our unofficial leader, a guy named Staff Sergeant Lisbon, told us, "Okay, fellas, there's an open square or plaza with a howitzer just up the street beyond the incline. It looks pretty heavily guarded by Canadian regulars. I gotta have all you machine gunners take the rooftops." He pointed up at the roof of the apartment buildings surrounding the plaza. He pointed towards the fire escapes, and a sergeant machine gunner rallied the others and immediately separated from their respective squads. Then he said, "The rest of y'all take the street and rush them when the LMGs are set up. Squad leaders, get some smoke at the ready. We're gonna fuck 'em hard and really fast once we got some fucking lead rain." Savarin separated from our squad to take the roof with the other machine gunners. The shelling in this part of the city masked any noise made by the gunners' move up the decaying fire escapes, and the resonating blast from the Canadian howitzer concealed our movement to the plaza opening. Maneuvering over the rubble and traveling smoke haze from that gun, we were soon all in place. The rest of my squad lined up with the other assaultmen while I readied a smoke grenade with a group of squad leaders by Lisbon. 25 of us took positions on the street, ready to storm the emplacement whenever the word was given. As soon as the last machine gunner disappeared over the roof, our forward lobbed smoke grenades at the opening to the complex. Not more than 10 seconds later, the sound of our gunners spraying the emplacement echoed. The machine gunners poured bullets all over the regulars, and we stormed the complex. I entered the plaza through the smoke with the rest of our guys and jumped behind some sandbags by the lookout sentry's post. I focused my R91 on the artillery crew and unleashed a spray of bullets with the last of my magazine, which happened to only be about 10 rounds. I watched 2 of the crewmen tumble to the ground and let loose screams that broke through the chaotic sounds of gunfire. I clicked a new mag into place and joined some of the others as we jumped over the sandbags. Fairly certain that our rooftop gunners had the place suppressed, we blitzed through the still thick, smoky war zone to push the remaining regulars out of the square. Just as I broke through a dense cloud near the gun, I was shot. As soon as I looked over at one of the regulars behind a building column, bang! He shot me right in the frontal chest plate. I wasn't bleeding, but the force behind the bullet was enough to knock me down. I stayed there on the ground, staring up at the red sky through the cracked lens on my gas mask as my breathing was made ever more difficult by that bullet and another failing filter. The pain in my chest was almost unbearable. I'm not sure when I broke from my trance after getting floored, but I looked around and heard a big explosion. I looked at one of the soldiers in our group and watched him as he ran toward a rubble pile for cover with his rifle up and its mag well empty. Right there, a grenade blew up, sending his arm into the air, and the explosion made him pirouette straight into the ash and rubble he was trying to reach. I watched that man die on the ground, an armless and bloody mess. The way his head twitched upwards from the ground made it appear he was crying. He probably was, but nobody could tell through the sounds of gunfire and bombs, and the man's mask and helmet-covered face. Roland's face suddenly entered my vision. He grabbed me by the arm and started dragging me before I fell unconscious. I'm pretty sure that bullet denting my chest and the scene I saw made me forget to breathe for however long that was. I woke up only a few minutes later, but it felt like I was out for days. I was against a building wall. The battle for the square or plaza was over, but the fight for Montreal was still going on. Jets and bombers still flew overhead, and my senses came back. My guys stood over me. "Look who's awake!" I looked to my left and right. There was a line of injured up against the wall, and Savarin was back with us. Savarin held out his hand and helped me up. Each of my boys patted me on the back and helmet and asked, "Are you all right, man?" I asked about where my pain was, since my chest plate still had a dent in it from that bullet, and Savarin pointed to Andrews. "Andrews got you covered. Thank God for body armor, because that would have been one mean hit without it." Quinn Andrews pointed at the red cross on his armor, and I gave him a sincere thanks. He nodded, I nodded, and I was about to ask about what he used to help me when I caught a look around. The square was quiet now, but fights down the street continued. In that moment, I looked back up to see vertibirds start to fly over us. Vertibirds were a new vertical takeoff and landing vehicle, VTOL, that was equipped with a frontal minigun, 3 bombs, and was able to carry 8 soldiers into the battle zone. That was a welcome sight, since it showed that the flak and missile trails of Canadian anti-air defense were almost gone. All our men were spread out across the square securing the perimeter, but we still didn't know who was in the buildings. Apparently nobody hostile though, or else our group would have been annihilated in the open square. But I looked around and counted 26 soldiers remaining from our team. Then I found Staff Sergeant Lisbon talking to some of the wounded, so I approached him and asked, "What should we do now, Staff Sergeant?" He turned around to look at me. His armor was cracked and torn. It was covered in dirt and ash. He didn't have a helmet anymore, and his right gas mask lens was cracked beyond any ability to see out of. He breathed heavily and held up his R91. He clicked a new magazine into place and said, "Now, we lock this fucking place down." We all assembled in the center of the square, except for the wounded. Lisbon said, "All right, men, if any of the Canadians are alive, bind them up with your zip ties. This seems like a good spot to fortify, and we got a lot of cleaning to do in case the fuckers roll through." We started to fan out across the square, account for Canadian equipment, move the dead, and check for captives. In the end, we had captured 4 Canadian regulars who were in the process of bleeding out. We bound them up and placed them in the center of the square by the howitzer. After checking in with Lisbon, 3 trucks pulled into the square from the way we came. All the troops in the back got out and assembled in front of us. I was still standing next to Lisbon with the rest of my squad and a few others when an officer in a patrol cap and breathing mask came up to us. He wore full combat gear and bore the rank of captain. The name tape on his chest plate said Mosby. His cap nearly covered his eyes and was distinctly Ranger rolled. The mask he wore covered half of his face, and his tinted goggles concealed his eyes. As he approached, most of us saw the 2 black bars and saluted out of lower enlisted stupidity. The officer shouted, "You enlisteds must really fucking hate officers? Lower your fucking hands. You fuckers ever seen a fucking goose swoop in and fucking 03 before? I did. Quebec City last month. Don't ever salute me again. We're in a fucking war zone. Fuck. Habits die hard." Every soldier nearby instantly obeyed. After his rage, the captain looked around the square and studied the row of dead bodies we were responsible for while nodding. He resumed more calmly. "I'm Captain Mosby, with the 166th Regiment, 3rd Battalion, Delta Company. I see you guys secured this square. Good spot." The 30 men in his truck group began to form a perimeter around the square or aid with our prior setup efforts, while the jets flew overhead and the noise of artillery still boomed. Before dispersing our gaggle, the acting captain said, "Good work, but the second wave of troops will be flowing through here to push the Canadians out of the city within the hour. That means that we need to clear this place out for the vertibirds and drop ships." A few men started to fire down the street, going north to the Canadian zone. One yelled, "We got contact." Captain Mosby's men moved in to engage the enemy. Upon finally noticing the bleeding captives by Lisbon, he said plainly, "Are these captives wounded?" Lisbon nodded and said that they were bleeding out and waiting for orders on how to proceed. Captain Mosby looked puzzled, even behind all that face covering, as he asked, "You boys all new to the Canadian front?" Most of us, including Staff Sergeant Lisbon, nodded, and Captain Mosby said, "Well, fucking kill 'em. I think they've been bleeding out long enough, don't you?" I was standing next to one of the captives. Lisbon, Severin, Stiles, and I held our guns to the heads of the captives. I looked down at my prisoner. He was only a boy, maybe 17 at most, only a year or so younger than I. He wore a ragged Canadian Army uniform, had blonde hair, and hung his head low, quietly accepting his situation despite the blood that silently streamed out of his thigh. I didn't know if the kid even spoke English. He could have only spoken French, but the look on his face and the cold steel pressed to his head was a pretty easy sign of understanding. We all flicked the safeties off our weapons simultaneously. I held the rifle to the back of the boy's head, wondering what, if anything, was going through the young soldier's mind. Lisbon stared at his captive and then quietly said, "Fire." The boy slumped to the ground dead. The blood leaked out and slowly grew, reaching the gutter. Thanks for listening to the first 5 chapters of David's story. I have been doing some edits to the story itself for fun, so it may be a while between videos. If you are interested in where the story goes, feel free to read ahead with the link in the description. Also, if you want a general idea of where this story goes, check out some of the artwork I've been making after the end of this author's note. Side note: given the story, its themes, and the fact I found a new tool to create my art, I recommend viewer discretion before viewing the artwork paintings, since some of it can be quite graphic or disturbing. You have been adequately warned per YouTube policy, so if you have a complaint about the images, you may keep them to yourself or take that as a golden opportunity to mature. Anywho, thanks for listening and feel free to read ahead or be disturbed by the mind of David.